All right, let's get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm Sri Vishwanath, CTO of Atlassian, and I have Mike Tria, who is head of platform with me. We are going to cover our journey into cloud native. This is not an incremental journey. It's actually transformational for Atlassian over the last few years. Our goal is to cover what we did, what happened, and most importantly, the lessons learned. I'm going to cover the first part, and Mike is going to come up on stage for the second part. Show of hands, how many of you use Atlassian or have used Atlassian before? That's awesome, all of you. All right, great. I love it. You all know Atlassian from outside. Let me give you some context of Atlassian from inside. First with the mission. Atlassian's mission is to unleash potential of every team. What this means is we focus on teams' productivity to make sure that every team is successful. And we started off our journey 17 years ago, and we focused on software teams. And over the years, we have expanded from software teams to all teams. That's why our mission is every team. Now, let's zoom back to 2015. I started at Atlassian in January of 2016, so this is life of Atlassian before I started. We had Jira and Confluence. We had a cloud product. We had a cloud product that had launched several years before, but it was a single tenanted architecture, which means that Jira and Confluence was running full stack, one per customer. And we had 100,000 instances of these instances running in production. And if you can imagine how hard that is, it was hard. But the beauty is our team had really automated that well. Right? So we could deploy the whole thing in 24 hours, undeploy everything in 6 hours. That's not really the future. So we envisioned a future where we wanted to get to a place where we are cloud native, and we are multi-tenanted, and adopt microservices. Right? So that was our goal. And as you can imagine, it looks easy, simple slide, but that difference is massive. Right? That difference is not just technological, but there's also cultural. So we'll cover those. In January of 2016, we kickstarted this project called Vertigo for basically achieving our end state. And it's a funny story. So one engineer came and saying, my head reels, and it's like spinning when I talk about this project. And that's how the project Vertigo name stuck. And that's funny. It was the largest project that Atlassian had ever done in terms of infrastructure. Atlassian has on-prem products, server and data center, and cloud products. So before we started Project Vertigo, we had the same code base, and we built it for on-prem, and we shipped it on cloud, single-tenanted, as I said. And that gives rise to deploying in a more on-prem-like cadence, but you can't have that on the cloud native. So the first thing we did, and this is a massive change and a proactive decision, we forked the organization and the code base. So we created a server on-prem organization and a cloud organization. And this fork of the org and code base helped us to make native choices in cloud. So we chose AWS. We went all in on AWS. Right? We said, if we want to build a service, you can use any service that's on AWS, which was the first choice that we made. And the reason we went down that path was speed of execution. Right? We wanted to focus on adding value to customers faster. So we wanted to get out of our own data center business, and we wanted to add features faster. And this is a major change. Right? So there's pros and cons of this. We won't cover details, but if you have questions, happy to cover those afterwards. The other part is Atlassian is a multi-product company. We have Jira, Confluence, Bitbucket, Many of them, all of them are homegrown. And then there are products that we have acquired. Trello, Status Page, Ops Genie. And Jira has a number of variants. And when we have all these products in an on-prem world, many of these on-prem products, you would duplicate code in all of those instances. And that's not how you need to be in cloud native. So we created a platform org where we started pulling down services that could be shared across these different products. And we created a number of microservices thoughtfully. And we started breaking down the monolith that we had for Jira and Confluence. Lastly, these are Atlassian values. And as I said, culture is extremely important when you do these massive projects. And Atlassian, I'm proud to say, has amazing values and culture. If you look at this, I don't spend a day in the office without hearing somebody saying, oh, yeah, we should do this because of our values, which play strongly. And even with the strong values, it's not a cakewalk when you do such massive projects and you have to change your culture. The two values that helped us in terms of culture and employees were play as a team, especially given we are distributed among a number of cities. We are in 9 different dev centers across the globe. And playing as a team, as a larger team, especially when things are breaking down and we are moving things around, is extremely important. And the second part is build with heart and balance, which is considering customers and also employees as we do things. Those two played extremely well in terms of the values and how we operated. And then customers. We are a customer-obsessed company. We also have swear words in our values, if you saw that before. We had 100,000 of these instances. So if you look at the timeline, we started this project January of 2016. And there was a lot of work that happened the year before that, but officially the project started January 2016. All of 2016 was basically a surgery on our platform. Creating the platform itself, pulling all the services down and building these services, making sure that we can make these services stateless, and making sure that we can shard them and run it cloud natively, multi-tenanted there. But we didn't do any customer migration in the first year. The first year, we had some customers. We tested them out, and we dog-fooded our own instances. And then the second year, 2016, for about 10 months, we thoughtfully migrated every single customer, 100,000 of those. And we were very careful in figuring out which cohorts of customers we wanted to migrate, and also figuring out that we had a bunch of work that had to happen to migrate all the corner cases and snowflakes that we had. The good part is our customers didn't even know this was happening until we started presenting and talking to them after it was done. And it helped us a lot in terms of just the journey itself, because they started saying, oh, the performance is much better. And then we said, oh, yeah, we spun up 3 different dev centers, 2 in Europe and 1 in APAC. And we could do that in like few weeks. And we had a plan for 18 months when we had our own data centers, and we could just spin that up much faster. So these are all the things that we did. Now let me call Mike Tria up to talk about what happened and what lessons we learned from that. Mike?
Hi, I'm Mike. So I run platform at Atlassian, the team that Sri just mentioned that built a lot of the underlying services, and the team that produces the greatest T-shirts at Atlassian. So how did we do? As Sri mentioned, we did 12 months of big surgery on these products. I think it's really hard to understate how big of a project this was for Atlassian. Let me talk a little bit about scale of these services and these products that really help drive the point home. JIRA and Confluence have been around at the time that we did the project for about 14 years. They each contained millions of lines of Java code. There is not one person at Atlassian, no founder, no engineer, that knows how it all works. Nobody. Raise your hand if you actually know how all of the code within your products work. Very few. Now imagine if you had millions of lines of code. All right? You have a lot of choices when you migrate to the cloud. Actually, a quick show of hands, who either has done or is on a journey to transform to move their stuff into the cloud? Okay, a lot of you, great. So you have a lot of options, right? You can lift and shift, right? That was one option that was available to Atlassian. We could have taken these very large stateful applications, and we could have just shifted them to move to the cloud. Another option is to rewrite them for the cloud. You can just start from scratch moving into the cloud. We elected the most difficult approach, which was to re-architect the products for cloud. So essentially lift them up, convert these very large multi-million line Java applications into stateless 12-factor microservices, JIRA and Confluence. So when Sri mentioned that we forked the code base, the forked version of cloud for JIRA and Confluence are stateless 12-factor apps. And these were products that were like using local disk as cache, right? So you can imagine the difficulty in the process. But it worked. And we actually ended up with a series of benefits as a result of that project. Through the next few slides, I'm going to try and condense what is essentially 4 years of learnings through the Vertigo project, and then the 2 years since then as we've moved to microservices. We now have over 1,000 microservices and over 1,500 developers at Atlassian. So we went from a world with no cloud to 4 years later, all in on cloud, Kubernetes. I think I'm using all but 7 AWS services at the company. So what did we get as a benefit? So the first one, the dev loop. It used to take about a week to deploy Jira and Confluence. Part of it had to do with the stateful nature of those products. Doing a deployment to Jira and Confluence at the time was downtime for a customer. You bring it down, you put the jar file on the machine, you bring it back up, hopefully it comes up. That was a deploy for Jira and Confluence. We did it about once a week. After the Vertigo project, we're doing deploys at least 2 to 3 times a day, and then thousands of other deploys from all the microservices in their universe. This has been incredibly helpful, especially when I talk about point 3. So the next one, this is actually my favorite. The ability to spin up the products in multiple regions. So in our last summit, I believe we announced the 6th region that our products are running in now for the products. So we've got 2 in APAC in Australia, 2 in Europe, and 2 in the United States. We had a plan to spin up Jira and Confluence in the data center in Germany, I think, for years, prior to when I joined Atlassian. During the project, so we're 1 year into this Vertigo project, right? So we're just starting to migrate customers. We're just running in the United States. We had a developer on the team who thought, you know, really to prove out the value of this whole Vertigo project, what if we just spun up the entire infrastructure of Atlassian's cloud running in Europe? Hogwash, madness, insanity. But we have this thing, these quarterly hackathons. They're called ship-its. And in one ship-it, this engineer and 34 of this engineer's comrades, the networking team, some people from the Jira team, our identity team, in 24 hours, they were able to show a demo at much fanfare within Atlassian of provisioning Jira and Confluence running in Ireland, which actually started our work of spinning up these data centers, which is just crazy because for us, that had been a 1.5 years and millions of dollars capital investment prior. But now it's trivial for us. Like we spin them up in weeks all the time. Third thing, and I mentioned I would talk about this when we talked about the first one, which is reduced downtime for our customers. This actually shows up in a lot of ways. The cloud versions of Jira and Confluence now, post-Vertigo, are far more stable and reliable, especially being stateless applications. It also means we can react faster. Doing a hotfix no longer takes 24 hours for Atlassian. It takes us 30 minutes on Jira and Confluence, and that is only getting faster and faster as we move more of it into microservices. And then lastly, the latency and speed. An interesting thing about the way that Jira and Confluence used to work is you had one container per customer. Everyone gets a container. You want to be a customer of Atlassian? Here's a container for you. Jira, Confluence, you get a container, you get a database, which is great if you're small, not so great if you're big, as you hit the walls of what that container can do. And so as a result of the migration, our largest customers got faster, but we also learned our smaller customers got faster too, because it turns out Jira and Confluence are heavy caching systems, and the startup time of actually warming up those caches on those big boxes if you have a small customer is actually really long. So we actually now have purpose-built machines for these customers, and it actually runs a lot faster. So those are our benefits, and we're really, really happy with them. However, we're still going. As I mentioned, I was going to condense 4 years into a series of lessons. So here's where we're at right now on our microservices journey. We have a common platform. 4 years ago at Atlassian, we had about 4 microservices. 2 years ago, we had, I think the number I remember was about 65 microservices. At last check, we have over 1,000 microservices running in Atlassian right now that power our production environment. And for those of you where I saw shudder on the idea of managing 1,000 microservices, I'll talk about how we were able to pull that off in a short period of time. But we now have a common platform that extracts out what we do at Atlassian. Second thing, we have happier teams. We do employee engagement surveys twice a year called Vital Signs. We ask teams how they're doing. Our teams that are not working on the monolith anymore, that are now working in microservices as a result of the migration, they're a lot happier, right? You can be a lot more autonomous when you're running a microservice system. You can build and deploy yourself without having to wait weeks for a pull request to get approved. And then lastly, you build it, you run it. I'm going to talk about this a lot. So in Atlassian, those 1,000 microservices are not run by an ops team. They are run by the developers that have built those services. We follow a you build it, you run it model. This gets into a big thing about the culture of your company being very important when you think about, should you move to cloud? Should you evolve and work on microservices or do serverless? I'm going to talk through a little bit in terms of the organizational things you need to look at to decide what works for you. And the reason I mention this is, for those of you that come to AWS reInvent, a great thing you get to hear is, how do other companies do it, right? You're all here in this room because you're listening about, how does Atlassian do it? And a question that we often get asked is, Atlassian, you were able to move to cloud. You built a whole bunch of tools that allow you to do it. Why don't you just offer those tools in the market? Why don't you just sell how you did it? And the reason we haven't done it yet is because of the very personal nature of why you would move to cloud and how you would do it. And there's a whole series of lessons that I'd like to share with you over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes that describe all of these lessons that you can take for you. So if you want to start taking notes, now's the time. We learned a lot of lessons, a whole lot. Those lessons, I'm going to try and group them into 4 areas that we'll talk about, or as I like to say, 3 areas and a bonus, because I like the bonus one that's going to come later. So let's get started and talk about all of the lessons that we learned of moving to the cloud and running thousands of microservices with thousands of developers starting from nothing 4 years ago. All right, first, most importantly, clear goals. This applies both to a migration and a transformation in the cloud, as long as running microservices. When Sri mentioned we were going to do this Vertigo project, we had a very clear goal, which was get every single customer moving in cloud, no exceptions, not 90%, not 99%, 100%, get it done in 2 years. Move every single person over. And the reason it's important to think through these very clear, specific goals is the Vertigo project isn't the first time that Atlassian has attempted a move to cloud. All right? We've had some work in the past where we've attempted to do that move, but without those clear set of goals on how we were approaching the problem, you get like halfway through the project and you would stop. And then you're left with some of that debt that's in the system. And we'll talk about debt a little bit later. But a clear set of goals are very, very important. Also, when it comes to microservices, right? You have to decide what makes sense for your business to do microservices. Microservices in and of themselves, frankly, are purely a means. They are not an end. They are not right for everyone. I'll talk about teams a little bit. If you've got a small group of people and you're all familiar with one tech stack and you've got a single product, I would suggest not moving to microservices. But for Atlassian, it made a lot of sense. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why it might make sense for Atlassian in terms of how we positioned our goals. So why things made sense for Atlassian. We are a suite of products. You saw a set of slides up there where we showed 6 major product groupings, and then JIRA has a whole bunch of stuff. Atlassian has a whole set of products. And our customers demand of us that those products somewhat work in the same way. It shouldn't be the case that you have to relearn how to upload an attachment every time you use a different product on Atlassian, or that you have to log out and log back in with a different username and password every time you use an Atlassian product, or the integrations, how they work with third parties. Those should roughly work the same. It's expected of us that a lot of our products feel similar when you're working with them. And so for Atlassian, prior to having a platform, the only way we could do that was sharing code. And that was a lot of fun. Taking a lot of shared Java code, moving it around between products, and having teams that would just deal with merges and conflicts. That was great. But for us, moving to microservices was great because it allowed us to extract out all of the common functionality of our products. A huge chunk of those 1,000 microservices I talked about are pieces of the products that we've pulled out into a common platform that allows Atlassian to build better products. So a suite of products, if you've got it, if you know you have multiple products, there's a good reason to use microservices there. Second thing, Atlassian is a big distributed team. For our size, we have a lot of dev centers. We've got developers in various parts of the world. Our heritage, we started out in Sydney, Australia. We've got teams in the Bay Area, in Europe, et cetera. And we've got, I would say at Atlassian, generally autonomous teams that decide what they're going to work on. For them, giving them an ability to control their own destiny in terms of having services and having them deployed out to production when they want and following a set of patterns really made sense for Atlassian. And then thirdly, the Vertigo project itself, right? Throughout the project, we had this whole initiative where we were able to focus the entire company for a period of time. There was one point I think we had over 200 people working on this project at one point in time within Atlassian, which is a huge chunk of Atlassian's engineering effort. And we had a bunch of open questions. Could we have a model where, let's say, the monoliths, Java, JIRA, and Confluence, could coexist with our microservices? Could we do it? And so we did a project that proved out a bunch of the really risky stuff ahead of time. And that was really helpful for us. So a set of clear goals backed by the things within Atlassian that made it work made sense for us. The second thing, tooling, tooling, tooling. I was talking to someone yesterday here on the show floor, and I was talking a little bit through this story and mentioned, oh yeah, we built a cohorting tool that let us understand customers, and then we built a static code analyzer because, like I mentioned, no one knows how all of JIRA works, so we had to write some products internally, tools to go through our own products and understand them a little bit better. We built tools for this, we built tools for that. And this person said, oh, you're everything you do is tools. You're tool builders. And it made me realize we actually are. We're tool builders. And I think that as you move, especially to microservices, you need tools that don't necessarily exist out there in the market that you need fit for you. I'll talk through a few of the ones that Atlassian's built and how they might apply to you. Secondly, we'll talk a little bit about consistency, right? So part of the reason some of you might shudder when you hear something like 1,000 microservices is 1,000 tech stacks, 1,000 ways of doing logging, 1,000 ways of doing monitoring, 1,000 ways of doing everything else. That's usually the worry, right? Distributed chaos. At Atlassian, we've used tooling and automation as our solution to how to drive some of that consistency within Atlassian. So 1,000 microservices doesn't frighten us, 5,000 doesn't frighten us, 10,000 might, who knows? So here are some of the tools that we built. And this one is the most important of all of them, which is a catalog of what your services are. So it would be quite the thing if during an incident, you've got some service called cs-proxy/new is breaking, and it's an upstream dependency for your service, and you don't know what it is. Not only you don't know what it is, you don't know who the on-call team is for it, who runs it, if they're even in the same building as you. So we built a service called Microscope. Microscope is our internal service catalog. It's a microservice catalog. Every developer within Atlassian can look at all the information for any microservice within the company. It contains things like the Ops Genie pager group. So if you just want to page that team, because there's a problem, you can page it right then and there. You can look at their Bitbucket repository that shows all their code. You can look at the team that actually owns the thing, its documentation. You can traverse its dependencies to the services that it depends on. You can request access to it. You can even look at the, raise your hand if you're familiar with SLOs, SLIs and SLOs. So those are essentially, SLIs and SLOs, SLO stands for service level objective. It's a reliability metric or a metric that you track against. So things like uptime, availability, performance. You can look at all those SLOs in Microscope as well. So we can see, is it working as we expect? This has been great. This has allowed us to have lots and lots and lots of microservices at Atlassian without having that the complexity of those services be the thing that crushes us. So it's fantastic. Second thing, tech stacks. At Atlassian, we support a few different tech stacks. Really, we support like Java/Kotlin, Node, and Go are some of the biggest ones. And there's some Python in there. And every once in a while, you can find some Clojure and Scala sneaking around. But for the most part, we built tooling around our tech stacks. So we've got a service internally that allows you to, let's say, spin up a new service, running it on a particular stack, and it precedes things like the logging for you. It precedes the monitoring. It precedes how we do caching or Hystrix or things like that, are all in tech stack tooling. I would say this is an area where you've got a choice to make when you're small. You could say, hey, it's in a container, I don't care. It's in a container, I don't care. However it runs. The difficulty that you will face over time is service ownership transfer, right? As those services move from team to team, if you've got a huge proliferation of tech stacks, then it's going to be really hard for you to ever transfer ownership. At Atlassian, we've tried to constrain that set of stacks to a smaller set. Granted, it's not one, but it's down to about 3 or 4, where we own the tooling for it, and we make it such that it is possible to move these services around within the company. So some amount of consistency on tech stacks I would highly suggest. Lastly, Service Quest. This is pretty novel stuff. The most dangerous part of the life cycle of a service is when it first receives production traffic, production customer traffic. So that's the first time you're going to actually see, does it do what I say, what I think it's going to do? In some companies, they have something called operational launch checklists or readiness checklists, where they check a few things to make sure, can my service go to production? Right? We have that too. There's a series of questions that we ask people, which is, have you done a DR exercise? Where are your backups? Have you tested restore? Have you run a load test where you look at 6 months of traffic going forward? Can you easily turn this thing on and off? Do you have features that are using feature flags? All of those things. But we took it a little step further. We've built tooling in that Microscope system that will automatically detect those checks for you and even greets a developer with information on how they could actually go and prepare their service for launch. By doing this, you don't need to have someone like me or one of our architects reviewing every single service as it goes out to production. We can have it in an automated fashion. And we check for a few things. We call it Service Quest because, like a quest, there's a lot of, I guess, quests that you have to achieve. And those quests are in 5 categories. And I'm going to see if I can remember all 5. So we've got quality, we've got service design or architecture, privacy, security, and reliability. So all the questions go in those 5 areas. This is actually something we're looking to possibly publish, to put out there, which is just a very healthy set of things. Like, if you do all of these things, then you will very likely have a service that when you put it into production is going to do what you think it's going to do. Services at Atlassian are also by tier. So very high tier services, like the network itself, might have a more stringent set that they have to achieve versus a lower tier service. So tools. Tools, we built tools during the infrastructure migration. We've built tools that have allowed us to manage the complexity in lots of microservices. This is really the engineering key to how we've solved on the microservices side on our cloud native journey. Third, culture. I think this is the one that it's very easy to understate how important culture is when you're on a cloud journey, either on a journey to cloud or you're trying to optimize your use of the cloud. And I think it's easy if you're familiar with DevOps to say, well, just do the DevOps transformation, move to DevOps. We've certainly done that. But there's actually a fair bit of art here in terms of how your teams run. So I'm going to talk through how Atlassian teams run and how that's affected us on our microservices journey as well. So people stuff. I'll tell you a story. So we had some really small teams within Atlassian. This was about 3 years ago, really small, talking like 2 people, 3 people. They would build a feature, right? And they were a team that would build a feature. And in a monolith, that's fine. But you know what the problem is when that's a service that needs to run in production when you have 2 people? The on-call rotation, right? 2 people does not an on-call rotation make. It's hard. So we've actually had to do, as a result of our microservices transition, reorgs within the company such that we've got sufficient size to allow teams to do you build it, you run it with on-call rotations. This is hard. This is hard stuff, right? Raise your hand if you know about Conway's Law. Conway's Law fans, that side of the room knows all about Conway. This side does not. So Conway's Law says that your architecture will mirror your org structure, right? So how you set up your org structure, you're going to build like API interfaces along those org boundaries. We had to reverse Conway, in a sense, within Atlassian by allowing those teams to have you build it, you run it, non-call rotations. So that's just one example. But also just having teams that understand how to run microservices. This is hard stuff. This took us years to get right. Years. Very hard. Second thing, managing expectations, right? So our goal was not to say everything should be a microservice. Remember when I talked before about our goals? We wanted to live in a world where we could coexist between monoliths and microservices. But we wanted to set expectations that we want to move towards a microservice world, right? One of the ways we set that is we tell teams, you know, you have a fair bit of debt perhaps on your team. Let's get to a place where, let's say 80% of the commits that you make are outside of that monolith. And we've been able to do that in a lot of teams. And so a set of expectations are really good to set there. And that actually starts all the way up at the executive team, right? So it starts with our founders and Shri, where they first said, you know, we want to be cloud native because we want to move fast in the cloud. We decided we could have built a layer that sits between us and Amazon, right? We could have done that, and then we could be, you know, fully cloud agnostic and multi-cloud. We didn't. We decided, let's just go for speed here. Let's go all in on what Amazon does and go and directly use those services and give developers direct access to those things. That's allowed us to move really fast, and that actually comes all the way from the top to the bottom. So making sure that you're all clear, both from the top of your company through what everyone is doing on the expectations of why you're doing what you're doing. Lastly, embrace this culture shift. We had, prior to Vertigo, we had ops teams, right? We had ops teams that, you know, developers would throw code over the wall, and we would manage those, manage that stuff running in production with a separate team. What happens to that team, right? Well, we trained them up on Kubernetes. It seemed to be a great fit, and it has actually been great. What we did is very early on during that journey, right? So fortunately, we talked to a few other peers that we knew of in the industry on how to do this right. And so we had a lot of good learnings there, like the learnings that you're all getting from this session, from other sessions that you're at. And so we really embraced this culture shift to cloud really early on within the company. When we did hackathons, we had people hacking on our cloud products, right, internally within the company or using new services. We also had teams, like I said, embracing this you build it, you run it. Some teams, right, they want to know deeply how their service works. They want to know, I want to log it in a particular way. I want to understand all the monitors, right, such that if I'm the one that's going to be woken up in the middle of the night, I want to be the person that can fix the thing. And so you actually had at Atlassian a huge shift where a bunch of developers that maybe didn't know how the product even worked in production now deeply understand how everything works end to end, which has been a huge boon for us at the company. So the bonus, balancing speed and trust. So Atlassian has a value, which is don't fuck the customer. It's the best one. It actually comes up in Confluence pages where we talk about technical decisions, and that value comes up a fair bit. It's quite bizarre. But it matters to us. And so how do we balance speed? We want to move really fast. I said we did a whole bunch of stuff in 4 years. We've gone to cloud native in 4 years from nothing. But how do we do that without breaking our customers? As Shri mentioned, we didn't even tell our customers about the move to the cloud. They didn't notice until after we started to talk about it publicly. Well, there were a few decisions that we made. And the following lessons, I think, are really super important on your journey to cloud. So, first one, hacks and workarounds, avoid them, especially during an infrastructure migration. Very much avoid these. So, when you go and do your migrations, you are going to go in and find a lot of debt that's already there. If you add to that debt, the debt that is produced from infrastructure migrations is the gnarliest, most difficult debt that you can fix. It's the hardest one. And so we added a lot of time to this project that we didn't need to add because we wanted to give teams the opportunity to clean debt up. We actually had a debt JIRA project where we keep track of debt that linked to people put comments in the code and it auto-generated JIRA tickets. I said we're tool builders, right? So we kept track of all this stuff and gave teams the time to clean up debt. When we had the opportunity to produce snowflakes, so a snowflake at Atlassian is when you have a single customer that has a custom configuration that's different than all the other customers. You can imagine how difficult it is having customers that have been running on cloud for a decade to move them over, and they had some custom config in an old version of Jira 7 years ago, right? We wanted to produce no new snowflakes. We wanted a consistent, coherent architecture. If you end up with a consistent, coherent architecture, you can do stuff like build Microscope and be fine with 1,000 microservices and have no problem. So during a migration, avoiding those hack and workarounds is incredibly important. The second thing, and this really goes to Atlassian values, that last 10%. So true story, we spent the first year re-architecting JIRA Confluence on our platform to support the migrations, and then the next year, migrating customers. The first 6 months, we did 90% of our customers. That last 6 months was that last 10%. The last 2 months was 500 customers. 2 months, 500 customers. Very, very hard. Again, I remember one of our goals, get to 100%, not 90%, not 99, 100%, get them all over. And this was a very hard problem. All of our tooling that we built around managing the analytics of these customers, very, very hard. They were all snowflakes. So what did we do about it? Well, we said, we're not going to fuck the customer. We don't want to just move them over and break them in cloud. So we built a Trello board. And that Trello board had a card for every one of those 500 customers. Each of those cards was assigned to an engineer, an individual engineer looking at an individual customer, going through and looking at their use cases, be it scale as they moved over, or a particular set of features that maybe didn't work cleanly on cloud. And we worked through card at a time to move those customers over. And I still remember the very last one moving to done in Trello. It was a wonderful feeling to see them all move over cleanly. The last one is all around checks and balances, right? So during the process, like I mentioned, we had a lot of opportunities to do this migration faster. Could have done it quicker, but it would have hurt our customers. We would have been faster, though. And we had great checks and balances within Atlassian. And the two places that we had them, one is your SRE team. If you have an SRE team, or an equivalent like DevOps team or production engineering team, really this is where they shine, right? Because they help you bridge the gap between how your code is operating on your production environment and the impact to your customer in terms of SLOs. And so that was incredibly helpful during our project, especially towards the end. The second one is our customer support team. Our customer support team met our migration team every single day. And we sat through the stats, we looked at the tickets. This became a great check and balance to know, oh, we're moving a little too fast in migrating search over. So let's maybe pull that back. Those were a really good set. So that is about 12 lessons on infrastructure migrations for a 2-year mega project and a journey to microservices on managing 1,000 things in a production environment at a company with 1,800 developers and tons of cloud products with hundreds of thousands of customers. So there's a lot in there. I'm going to leave it there, and then I think we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to ask some questions, I think we've got 2 mics there, and we can take some time. Thank you. Yeah, so I guess I'll walk up. Yep, perfect. Maybe start over here.
Hi, my name is Mark Heathershaw from Portland, Oregon. I just had a question. How did you go about onboarding new customers during this effort for Vertigo?
Sure. There reached a point during the project where we were still onboarding customers into the old system. And there was a flip point where once we had enough of the set of features that we wanted to have in cloud, it essentially flipped at that point to migrate new customers into the cloud products. However, really important here, you don't want that to be a simple on-off switch where you then start to migrate all new customers onboarded into cloud. The reason for that is you might have a surge of customers that come in, and you might hit some scaling boundary or performance problem. So we actually did it on a percentage basis. We started with like 10% of new customers would start to be onboarded into cloud, and the other 90% would still be onboarded into the old the old server instance. And so then we just watched those stats very closely and then flipped it over, probably in a period of a month or 2.
And that happened early in the
very early on. Yeah, we started like the new customers were being on the Vertigo system long before all the rest of the customers were migrated. Yeah. Cool. Maybe on this side now.
Hi, you mentioned coexisting with the monolith and the microservices and proving that out. Does that mean that some of the microservices team were responsible for maintaining the portions of the code from the monolith where the code originally came from, or what is the team interaction between the on-prem monolith version and the microservice people?
Can you
in terms of the questions around teams, like basically interoperating, still working code on the monolith versus on the microservices. We had a bit of both. So there are some developers that were on the monolith teams that started to work on the microservices, and vice versa. There were some teams that were already doing some microservices work that worked on the monolith. We didn't do like a hard partition where we said, you're a monolith team, you're a microservices team. Within the product teams, there's a different mix depending on how far those products are in migrating to microservices. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, and we also didn't mandate that you had to create all these microservices and build down the monolith as part of this. Teams logically came in and said, oh, to do this change, it's better to actually create microservices. So microservices wasn't part of the initial goal. That was a journey that we were on. We didn't say we had to create 500 services. And we are still creating more services. We still have a monolith that's much smaller, but it's still there. So that wasn't, creating microservices wasn't part of the original goal.
You mentioned Microscope tool. Do you have any details about it, or maybe it could be shared as open source or even maybe a product?
Details to share on Microscope itself?
Yeah.
You want to open source it? We're talking about that. We're talking about that. It's not a very complicated system, right? The hard part of building catalogs is actually the user experience, honestly, because what you want is you want developers to be able to easily update this thing in a clean way. If it takes like 5 minutes for the damn page to load to just update their service, they're never going to do it, and you have a catalog that is out of date. So if you're going to build one, and well, assuming we don't open source one, and you're going to build one, I would suggest that you focus on actually making it snappy, because the measure of success for these things is how accurate they are. That's actually the only thing that matters. That's the measure of success. So make it really, really easy to input information and use. That's it.
How are you nudging the remaining customers that are still in the old code base, if you will, on premises, to move to the SaaS native products?
Yeah, so that's a different effort. So the way we talk to the customers, they have a choice, right? They have chosen on-prem, we have cloud. We have a migration team that builds tools that can help move from on-prem to cloud, and we are making it better and easier so that one click you need to be on the cloud. So that's a completely different effort outside Vertigo, but we focus a lot on it. We have a team on it. We have tools for that too. And if you are, many of you, if you're using on-prem, you should definitely check out cloud and use the migration tools to move over.
I'm curious about the last 10% problem that you described. You know, in our company, teams often work on very long projects where the last 10%, sometimes the talent, you know, migrates away from the project, and I'm curious if that was an issue you had and how you solved that.
That was absolutely a potential problem, which was, you know, you've gone through 90%, people want to start doing other things, right, and working on that. I think we were fortunate in two things, and one, I'll call them out right here, right? So Sri and our founders were very much in like, get this to 100%. It's the most important thing in the company, period. Having that executive sponsorship and buy-in really helped us, right? When, you know, you're going up against product deliverables that we might want to build, and there's that one developer that really knows the caching system, and we really want to keep that person on. It actually really helped with it. But I think the second thing is we really made it a mission internally on getting to 100%. And so that being said, it's not like we needed 200 people at the end of the project. Once you got down to that smaller set, we really much more formed like a SWAT team that went and worked on those people. But yeah, if you don't get it, I've got history of getting these things to like 95% and then stopping, and then the next person that comes along sees the fact that, oh, they got to 95%, I'm going to get to 100, and then they get to 95% too, and you have this heritage of all this debt from previous migrations in there. That's why I mentioned that getting to 100% is so important. So a combination of like driving it from a mission and executive sponsorship really helped us.
Yeah, it's extremely important to explain that, because if you add debt to another debt, yeah, you get death.
Yeah, that's our problem.
When you were working on consolidating your tech stacks, how did you balance sort of bringing maybe individual teams really good ideas with the need to have some top-down sort of direction?
So we do what we call like paved paths. And so let's say you want to use some tech stack that Atlassian doesn't use at all. I don't know. I actually don't. We're using so many, it's hard for me to even name one we're not using. But imagine you want to do that. Well, what we will tell teams is then, well, if you still have to obey the contracts of all the other tech stacks and what they're doing, you have to log in this particular direction. You have to log in this way. Your monitoring and stuff has to be exposed in this way. You have to manage environment variables deployed in the same way, talk to services the same way. As a company grows, that list gets bigger and bigger. And for some teams, it's just easier for them to use the existing set of tech stacks for which we've built. It's not like we tell them, no, you absolutely cannot use it. It's very rare that we would do that. But most teams within Atlassian just choose to use the easy way because the other way is actually very difficult. It'd be very different if you're just getting started when you don't have all those requirements and constraints. But as you scale, that consistency is incredibly important, and people buy into that.
Just to restate, so you're sort of like, you defined a set of like policies that people need to adhere to, and there's sort of like, here's the pre-built version, or
Yes.
you can kind of roll your own, but.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You brought up how you guys went from doing deploy every 2 to 3 weeks to daily multiple times a day. Did you guys mandate that your teams use like use Bitbucket pipelines to do CI, CD stuff, or can they also do their own pay? I mean, like, did they have their own choice in how they would, build and
deploy?
Build and deploy their code?
They had no choice. So there were reasons for that. There's reasons for that. It has to.
What was the choice though? I mean, like, what did they end up
internally?
Yeah.
You can use Bitbucket pipelines or Bamboo.
Either.
You can use either, yeah. Well, in specific cases, right, we actually internally within Atlassian, actually there's a bit of a split. There's a bit of a split between Bamboo and Bitbucket pipelines. It depends on what you're doing. For a long time, it was only Bamboo. And the reason it was only Bamboo is because as a company that is public and Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, we have to do things like guaranteeing that artifacts that are coming from code are the actual things that are running on production through a process that we could, that is audit strong and tamper proof. And so we hardened that into Bamboo and said, if you follow this deploy plan within Bamboo, we can make the pass for the auditors. And so that's why. Now, Bitbucket pipelines, we're actually getting there. And so a lot of teams are moving over to that system. But those are the only two options within Atlassian.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, and having a tools team and having a build team that can automate those helped all the newer services that came in just to use those. It's paved path that Mike mentioned.
Big time.
In terms of the monolith and code that's out there for it, when you bring a microservice online, can you talk a little bit about when the right time is to maybe get rid of the code in the monolith and how you guys kind of solve that problem?
Yeah, so the challenge with those kinds of things, it's hard to convince the business that we'll spend 6 months with 20 engineers just to break down the monolith, and you would have exactly the same thing that you had before. So I see some head nods here. It would be better if you actually have a business reason on why you would want to break it down, right? So it could be that you can't scale up beyond certain things. It could be that performance is not there. You couldn't add feature fast enough. So if you can have a business reason on why you need to break it down further, I think that's a good thing. For Vertigo, ours was not to break down the monolith and create microservices. It was mostly to create a cloud native, and speed was an aspect. So as long as you can tie it into your business goals and say that it's not doing it just for the sake because engineers love it, I think that actually helps a lot. And we had those reasons here.
Just to follow up on that, do you guys sunset that code eventually, or when you do have those business cases? And then that was kind of where I was going.
Yeah, the monolith has shrunk because we have peeled out and created microservices. And we have also removed a bunch of code in hackathons. The best hackathon projects are actually people saying, oh, I removed 25,000 lines of code, right? We love those kinds of projects. Yeah.
Hi, so I noticed, so you mentioned, and one of the principles of moving to a cloud native architecture was that there was a dedicated SRE, and also part of it is also that developers, you build it, you kind of own it, you maintain it, you are on call for it. So what role do SREs play in the org right now? If developers own, maintain, are on call for it, monitor it, then how are SREs implemented, I guess?
Sure.
And do they need to, do they need to like know everything or?
No.
Yeah.
The SREs at Atlassian, I mean, SRE at every company does something a little bit different. At Atlassian, there really are two ways that SREs are involved there. One, they're building a lot of the tools around reliability that those teams are using, right? So the system I mentioned that produces and pushes SLOs into Microscope was built by the SRE team, right? So they're doing that pure like engineering approach to operations, from the Google book, right? We are doing that, right? So they're building reliability tools for teams, that's one. Two, facilitation, right? So they're showing teams how to do war games. They're showing them how to set up good monitors and alerts and possibly jumping in and spiking those monitors with those teams. Teaching them around how to do good DR, backup and restore processes, running game days, helping with our incident management process, training people on how to be on call and how to do all that. So they don't need a full understanding of the entire system. They're showing Atlassians how to be reliable and then building the tools to support it.
I see. So in a way, they act a lot as guidance and coaching rather than doing the actual monitoring and incident response.
For the most part, yes. We have some teams that actually have SRE teams that can play that role. For some of them, the vast majority do not. And then they fall into exactly what you described.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's also a scaling thing, right? If you have microservices that are 8% teams, you can't scale SREs for all of them, so you need to pool and figure out how to optimize for the larger piece.
Yeah, Sri does not want to hear that like I'm the reason the company can't scale because I have to hire too many SREs. Yeah.
Hey, hello there. As part of the journey, can you talk about your dynamics with the security team? Were they part of the cloud team, or were they a separate entity? Can you talk about that?
Sure, go. Yeah, we have a separate security team, but the good part is we have the play as a team value that we had. So even though they're a separate team, they actually work extremely well together, and that has worked really well. So, and that's not just for security team. We have a number of teams, product management and engineering, security and engineering. So all these different teams play extremely well together. So we have less of, oh, I need somebody else to do things, let's coordinate more. We don't have issues with having people help out or pitch in and do the program management of that. The challenge that we have is actually reverse, where we have a lot more help coming in, and because we have a nice culture, people don't say, yep, stay away from me, let me do my job, right? So it's actually nicer than.
Do you run into a problem where your cloud team was far ahead and you had to teach your security team, or vice versa?
We have evolved our security team quite a bit in the last few years, and our security team was much smaller 3 years ago. Now we have scaled up at least 4x in the last 3 years. So security team definitely couldn't do a whole bunch of things that they were supposed to do, so now we have scaled up. Initially, security team mainly focused on perimeter security and making sure that they could do security incident response. And we are now shifting left to help out with the development piece. Maybe you can add.
Yeah, so product security is now a big thing at Atlassian in the last 1 or 2 years. Like I can speak from like personal experience where I remember our networking team was proposing ideas to the security team about how to improve some of our border security and the NATs, and it's now completely flipped, where my team is now sitting with open ears learning about the latest and greatest on like service-to-service authentication from our product security team. So our security team is actually involved in our infrastructure and the architecture and like essentially plumbing in security by default, which is great. It's been that way now more in the past few years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, y'all recently released a blog about micros. Did that play a role in this cloud journey?
Did Micros play a role?
Right.
100%. Yeah, so Micros is the system that JIRA and Confluence and all of our microservices sit on top of. It is our paths. And so that's the system that one of the slides I mentioned had a common platform. That common platform is built on a microservices platform, which is Micros.
in that enabler, do you think that that was like a huge part of the success of, speed to market for your different teams?
I think so, yeah. I think if you don't have it, you have every team reinventing all of those things every time they want to essentially push code out into production. So Micros is a system that orchestrates the cloud, right? So it spins up EC2 and RDS and everything for Atlassian internally. And yeah, that's definitely helped us because you have developers at Atlassian that might know how things work on Micros, but might not know how they actually work on Amazon. And so yeah, I would say that's given us speed.
Especially if you have a large company and lots of people, it's important to standardize that because that's important. And then you can build tools around it and visibility and observability on top. So it's important to have the infrastructure layer somewhat consistent.
Great, thank you.
Hey, the you build it, you run it pattern makes a lot of sense to me. I think eventually active development probably stops on some services, and then maybe the people who were building it, they go to work on the next cool thing, right? Organizationally and culturally, how do you handle like still supporting the services where activity has been a little bit dormant and making sure they don't get kind of lost?
That's a very, very good question, and that is the pointy end of microservices, right? Is end of life or when a service goes into maintenance mode. So one way we get around that is through some set of rituals. We're always doing DR exercises and performance testing and game days, and these things are always stressing those services. And chaos as well. There's also new requirements for services, even the ones that are going into maintenance mode. We might look at some new form of compliance we're going to do, and that hits across that service. It is strong ownership of services is required at Atlassian for you build it, you run it. So even that service that was built 4 years ago that we really haven't had to touch in 2 years goes through game days and DR exercises and backup and restore so that we keep the team fresh.
Yeah, the other thing we have done is we have grouped services into service groups, and teams own service groups. So even though there's like 20% of or 50% of the services are never worked on, that team is responsible for all of the services in that service group.
So,
Go this way.
Okay, thank you. How to identify boundaries for each microservice?
Do you want to take that one?
How do you identify boundaries for microservices? Yeah, no, that's a good question, and there's no generic answer. Some teams, you can go as fine-grained as you want, or you could do a much bigger. It depends on what kind of teams you have and what kind of architecture you are trying to design. But the one thing to take care of pros and cons on this is you should let teams design and choose what they want to do. As long as you have good tooling across, you shouldn't worry about number of services that you have, right? If you don't have tooling, then you definitely shouldn't do fine-grained and should limit number of services. For us, grouping these services into service groups helped us work around that. So we let teams do whatever we want. We don't like just one-off ones for one thing. We want to have it somewhat consistent to have a logical grouping. But otherwise, we don't have to worry about that because we have the tooling in place.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, I guess we are out of time.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Avmar.
And we'll be here, so you can.
Yeah, we'll be around.